I never planned on becoming my husband's boss. But then again, he never planned on me discovering the offshore account where he'd hidden our life savings. The same account that funded his girlfriend's luxury apartment in Miami. Life has a way of surprising us both. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The Chicago skyline sparkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office at Meridian Dynamics, casting long shadows across the polished concrete floor. Rain tapped gently against the glass, creating a soothing rhythm that usually helped me focus on complex analysis reports. But today, my attention kept drifting to the unopened envelope on my desk. "Morgan, the board is waiting. Are you ready?" Zoe Taylor, my executive assistant, stood in the doorway, her tablet clutched against her chest. She'd been with me since I started at Meridian 5 years ago, rising through the ranks from junior operations analyst to head of strategic restructuring. "Just give me 1 minute," I replied, sliding the envelope into my drawer. It was my 15th anniversary today, and James had slipped the card into my bag this morning before leaving for his own office at Pinnacle Ventures, the boutique investment firm where he'd been developing client relationships for the past decade. I gathered my presentation materials, smoothed my charcoal Donna Karan suit, and followed Zoe toward the boardroom. The click of my heels against the floor matched the steady confidence I'd spent years cultivating. At 38, I'd become known for turning troubled companies into streamlined success stories. Executives trusted me to see patterns others missed and implement systems that prevented exploitation or waste. "They're nervous about the Westridge acquisition," Zoe whispered as we approached the boardroom. "Harrison didn't like your recommendation to delay." I smiled slightly. Harrison never likes it when someone suggests caution over immediacy. That's why his last 3 acquisitions lost value within a year. The boardroom fell silent as I entered. 8 executives, mostly men in their 50s and 60s, watched me approach. Only Diane Chen, the CFO who'd recruited me to Meridian, offered a smile of genuine welcome. "Morgan, we've been reviewing your preliminary analysis," said Robert Harrison, leaning forward in his chair at the head of the table. His Brooks Brothers suit couldn't hide his impatience. "Some of us have concerns about the timeline you're proposing." I set my materials down and met his gaze directly. "I understand the desire to move quickly, Robert. But my team has identified several irregularities in Westridge's financial reporting that need to be resolved before we proceed." For the next 40 minutes, I methodically walked the board through my findings. The discrepancies were subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them, but potentially devastating if ignored. I'd developed a systematic approach to examining financial structures, one that James had often teased me about being unnecessarily thorough. "Morgan sees financial traps the way some people see hidden images in those magic eye pictures," he'd joke at dinner parties, his hand warm on my lower back. "I just see numbers, but she sees stories those numbers are trying to hide." I used to appreciate his acknowledgement of my skills, even if it came wrapped in gentle teasing. Now, standing before the board, I leveraged those same skills to protect Meridian from a potentially disastrous acquisition. Based on these inconsistencies, I concluded, I recommend we extend our due diligence period by 60 days and engage Spencer and Walsh to conduct a forensic audit before proceeding. Harrison's face tightened, but Diane nodded slowly. "Morgan's instincts on these matters have saved us from at least 2 problematic acquisitions in the past 3 years," she reminded the room. "I am moved that we accept her recommendation. Sue." Vote passed 7-2. As the meeting adjourned, Diane lingered, waiting until the others had left before approaching me. "Another bullet dodged," she said with a slight smile. "How do you always spot these things, Morgan?" I gathered my materials, thinking about my answer. "I look for what people try to hide. Every financial record tells a story, not just about numbers, but about behavior. When I see inconsistency in the numbers, I'm really seeing inconsistency in someone's actions." She studied me for a moment. That's why I brought you on board. That kind of insight is rare. She paused. By the way, Nancy and I would love to have you and James over for dinner next weekend. It's been too long. I'll check with him, but I think we're free, I replied, feeling a flutter of anticipation about our anniversary plans for tonight. James had been hinting at a surprise for weeks. Back in my office, I finally opened his anniversary card. The handwritten note inside read, Morgan, 15 years of adventure. Sorry to miss tonight, but an emergency client meeting in Denver. Back Friday. Dinner at Kingston then? Love always, Jay. I stared at the card, disappointment settling like a weight in my stomach. This was the third time in 2 months that James had canceled plans at the last minute. Each time it was for an emergency client meeting in a different city. Each time he apologized with expensive makeup plans. I glanced at my watch, just past noon. James's flight to Denver shouldn't have left yet. I dialed his number, but the call went straight to voicemail. Not unusual when he was boarding. I sent a text instead. Just got your card, safe travels, call when you land. As I set my phone down, Zoe appeared in my doorway again. The Westridge CEO is online too. He's not happy about the delay. I nodded, pushing personal disappointment aside to focus on work, something I'd become increasingly good at over the past year as James's emergency meetings grew more frequent. Afternoon passed in a blur of calls and analysis. At 6, as most of the office was emptying, my desk phone rang. It was Kevin Russo from IT. Ms. Edwards? I've completed that security audit you requested. Could you come down to review the findings? There are some irregularities you should see in person. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in Kevin's cluttered office, staring at his monitor as he showed me the results of a routine security sweep I'd requested after noticing unusual access patterns in our client database. See these login credentials? Kevin pointed to a highlighted section of his report. Someone's been accessing sensitive acquisition data using an expired password authorization. The weird thing is, the credentials belong to Thomas Wells, who left the company last year. I frowned. How is that possible? Shouldn't those credentials have been deactivated? That's just it. They were deactivated. But someone reactivated them remotely 3 months ago and has been using them intermittently since then. Kevin scrolled through more data. Based on the access patterns, they're specifically targeting information about potential acquisitions before the deals become public. My mind raced through possibilities. Can you tell who did this? Kevin shook his head. Not definitively, but I can tell you when and where the credentials are being used. He pulled up another screen. Most recently, they were used from an IP address associated with... He paused, looking uncomfortable. Associated with what, Kevin? Pinnacle Ventures, your husband's firm. The words hit me like a physical blow. I kept my face carefully neutral, years of boardroom negotiations helping me mask my shock. I see. And what information specifically has been accessed? For the next half hour, Kevin showed me exactly what data had been compromised. It was clear someone was using insider information about Meridian's upcoming acquisitions. Information that would be extremely valuable to investors who could position themselves ahead of public announcements. I need all of this documented, Kevin, and I need you to keep this strictly confidential while we investigate further. Of course, Ms. Edwards. He hesitated. Should I report this to Mr. Harrison? Not yet, I replied, my mind already formulating a plan. I want to gather more information first. Can you continue monitoring these activities without alerting the user? Kevin nodded. I can set up a shadow tracking system. They won't know we're watching. Do it, I said, standing to leave. And Kevin, thank you for bringing this to me directly. The rain had turned into a downpour by the time I left the office. Instead of heading home to our lakefront condo, I drove to our bank. I needed to check something, a suspicion that had been forming. Since Kevin's revelation, At the bank, I requested access to our safe deposit box. James and I had opened it together when we first married, using it for important documents and valuables. I hadn't visited it in over a year. The bank manager led me to the vault. "Here you are, Mrs. Edwards. Take all the time you need." Inside the small private room, I opened the box with shaking hands. My grandmother's pearl necklace should have been there, along with her sapphire earrings, family heirlooms James had suggested we store securely after a break-in at a neighbor's apartment last year. The box was empty except for some insurance. Papers. I sat down heavily, pieces clicking into place. The canceled plans, the late nights, the emergency client meetings. And now, missing jewelry and compromised company information from my employer. Information that would be valuable to James's investment clients. Outside, thunder rumbled across the Chicago skyline. I needed to know more before confronting James. If he was selling Meridian's confidential information, that was corporate espionage. If he'd taken my family jewelry, that was something else entirely. I pulled out my phone and called the one person I knew could help me navigate what was coming. "Diane? It's Morgan. I need your advice on something sensitive. Can we meet tonight?" An hour later, I sat across from Diane in her elegant Lincoln Park home, rain tapping against the windows, as I explained what I'd discovered. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. "The missing jewelry could be a misunderstanding," Diane said carefully, setting down her wine glass. "But the data breach..." She shook her head. "Morgan, that's serious. If someone at Pinnacle is using Meridian's confidential information for trading advantages..." "I know," I interrupted. "It's securities fraud at minimum, corporate espionage at worst." Diane studied me, her expression softening. "And you think James might be involved?" I stared into my untouched wine. "I don't know, but the access is coming from his firm. He's been acting strange for months, and suddenly my family heirlooms are missing from our safe deposit box." I looked up at her. "What would you do?" She didn't hesitate. "I'd gather evidence quietly. If it's nothing, no harm done. If it's something..." She trailed off. "Morgan, you're one of the smartest people I know. You're methodical. You see patterns others miss. Use those skills now." I nodded slowly. "I need to check our personal accounts too. If he's taken the jewelry, do you have access to all the accounts?" "I should. We've always maintained transparency with finances." Even as I said it, I realized I hadn't actually looked at our joint accounts in months. James had taken over managing our day-to-day finances last year, claiming it would give me one less thing to worry about while I focused on my career. "Start there," Diane advised. "And Morgan, whatever you find, remember you have support. Nancy and I are here for you." The drive home through the stormy night gave me time to think. By the time I reached our condo, I had a plan. James wouldn't be back until Friday. I had 2 days to investigate without interruption. Inside our home, everything looked as it always did. Modern furniture we'd selected together, art from our travels, photos from happier times, hiking in Colorado, sailing on Lake Michigan, our wedding day on the California coast. I went straight to James's home office. The space was meticulously organized, something we had in common. His desktop computer was password protected, but I knew all his passwords. Or at least I thought I did. None of the usual combinations worked. I sat back, surprised. James had changed his passwords without telling me. Another small betrayal to add to the growing list. Moving to Plan B, I opened his desk drawers. Most contained ordinary office supplies and documents I was familiar with. But the bottom drawer was locked, something new since I'd last had reason to look through his desk. I remembered the spare key James kept hidden behind the family photo on his bookshelf. The small key was still there, but when I tried it in the drawer, It didn't fit. Frustrated, I surveyed the room. What else had changed without me noticing? I ran my hand along the underside of the desk, an old trick my father, a carpenter, had taught me about hidden compartments. My fingers found a small irregularity in the wood. Pressing it released a hidden compartment built into the desk itself. Inside was a single key and a small notebook. The key opened the locked drawer, which contained financial statements from a bank I didn't recognize. Sierra Pacific Private Banking, based in Nevada. The statements were for an account in James's name only, an account I never knew existed. The most recent statement showed a balance of $1.2 million. Our life savings had been just over $1.5 million, carefully accumulated over 15 years for our eventual retirement and the family we'd planned to start, once the timing was right. That timing had never seemed to arrive, always pushed back by career opportunities or market conditions. With shaking hands, I opened the notebook. Inside were handwritten notes, amounts, dates, and initials. The most frequent initials were RK, with amounts ranging from $5,000 to $25,000 noted beside them. The last entry, dated just a week ago, read, RK, Miami Apt Lease signed, 18500 Mahler, transfer complete. I sat perfectly still, absorbing what I was seeing. Someone named RK had an $1,850 per month apartment in Miami, paid for by funds from James's secret account, an account that appeared to contain our life savings. I pulled out my phone and logged into our joint accounts I hadn't checked in months. The balances were far lower than they should have been. Our investment portfolio had been nearly liquidated, with only about $300,000 remaining across all accounts. James had taken our life savings and was spending it on someone else. Thunder crashed outside, matching the storm building inside me. I wasn't just angry, I was calculating. Years of professional training kicked in. This wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was financial fraud. And if Kevin's discovery about the data breach was connected, it was much worse. I carefully photographed everything, the statements, the notebook, the account information. Then I returned everything exactly as I found it and left the office. In our bedroom, I packed an overnight bag. I couldn't stay here tonight, surrounded by memories and questions. As I was about to leave, my phone chimed with a text from James. Just landed in Denver. Weather delay. Sorry about the anniversary. We'll make it up to you. Love you. I stared at the message, wondering how many other lies it contained. Was he even in Denver? Did he love me? Has anything in our marriage been real? I didn't reply. Instead, I called Zoe. I need a favor, I said when she answered. Something personal. Can you meet me at the office early tomorrow? 7 a.m.? Of course, she replied without hesitation. Everything okay? No, I said honestly. But it will be. I'm just going to need some help. I ended the call and took one last look around the condo that had been my home for the past 8 years. Then I walked out, closing the door on more than just the physical space. As I drove through the rainy Chicago night toward the hotel I'd booked, I was already formulating a strategy. James had underestimated me, professionally and personally. He thought I was too trusting, too focused on my own work to notice his deception. What he didn't realize was that the same skills that made me valuable to Meridian, my attention to detail, my ability to see patterns in financial data, my talent for strategic restructuring, were about to become his worst nightmare. He'd spent our life savings on his mistress. He had no idea he'd soon be working for me. The Langford Hotel's lobby gleamed with polished marble and soft lighting, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside me. I approached the front desk, wheeling my small overnight bag behind me. "Welcome to Langford, ma'am," said the receptionist, her smile professional and practiced. "Do you have a reservation with us tonight?" "Yes, under Morgan Edwards," I replied, sliding my credit card across the counter. Not our joint card, but my personal one, the one linked to the separate account I'd maintained since before our marriage. James had always teased me about my independence fund, calling it an unnecessary precaution in a trusting relationship. That precaution didn't seem so unnecessary now. As the receptionist processed my check-in, my phone buzzed with another text. From James. "Everything okay? You didn't respond to my last message." I slipped the phone back into my pocket without answering. What could I possibly say? "Yes, everything's fine. Except I just discovered you've emptied our life savings and might be involved in corporate espionage? You're all set, Ms. Edwards. Room 1142. Elevators are to your right," the receptionist said, handing me a key card. "Is there anything else you need this evening?" "Privacy," I replied. "I'm not accepting visitors or calls." In my room, I laid out everything I knew so far in my usual methodical fashion. I opened my laptop and created a secure document with 3 sections: financial evidence, data breach, and timeline. Under financial evidence, I listed missing jewelry from safe deposit box secret Nevada bank account with 1.2 million depleted joint investment accounts. Notebook with payment records to RK $1,800 month. Miami apartment under data breach. Unauthorized access to Meridian acquisition data source of breach. Pinnacle Ventures IP addresses. Thomas Wells reactivated credentials, timeline of access correlating with specific acquisition targets. I stared at the timeline section, trying to identify when things had changed. James's emergency client meetings had increased about 8 months ago. Around the same time, he'd offered to take over managing our daily finances. 6 months ago, he'd suggested moving my grandmother's jewelry to the safe deposit box after the neighbor's break-in. The data breach at Meridian had begun 3 months ago. I opened a browser and typed RK Miami Real Estate. Nothing useful came up in the first several pages of results. I tried various combinations: RK Miami Model, RK Miami Finance, RK Miami Pinnacle Ventures. The last search brought up a business article from 6 months ago. Pinnacle Ventures expands Miami presence, hosts exclusive client event. The accompanying photo showed a group of well-dressed professionals at what appeared to be a cocktail reception. I recognized James immediately, smiling confidently in the center of the group. But what caught my eye was the woman standing beside him, tall, striking, with long auburn hair. The caption identified her as Rachel Keller, Pinnacle's new director of Client Relations, Southeast Region. Arcade Eye searched Rachel Keller Pinnacle Ventures, and dozens of results appeared. LinkedIn showed she'd joined Pinnacle 11 months ago, coming from a smaller firm in New York. Her Instagram account was public, showcasing a lifestyle of luxury travel, designer clothes, and exclusive restaurants. I scrolled through her recent posts, my stomach tightening with each swipe. There was the Miami skyline from a high-rise balcony. A sunset champagne toast with a man's hand visible but his face cropped out. A selfie wearing sapphire earrings that looked eerily similar to my grandmother's. The most recent post, from just 2 days ago, showed a plane window view with the caption, "Denver bound for a quick business trip. Work and play, Mile High City, Denver," where James claimed to be having an emergency client meeting. My hands shook as I set down the phone. This wasn't just a financial betrayal anymore. This was my life, my marriage, unraveling in real time. I looked back at my laptop screen at the organized list of evidence. My professional instincts kicked in. When faced with fraud, follow the money. I needed more information about that Nevada account. Sierra Pacific Private Banking had no obvious online portal for customers. It appeared to be the type of exclusive financial institution that catered to high-net-worth clients seeking discretion. But every bank, no matter how exclusive, had to send statements. I pulled out my phone and called our home landline, connecting to the answering machine. "James, it's me. I needed to get the insurance documents for my car renewal, but I can't remember where you filed them. Can you call me back? I hung up, knowing it was a message that would prompt him to respond quickly without raising suspicion. Sure enough, less than 5 minutes later, my phone rang with James's number. "Hey, what's up with the insurance papers?" he asked, the sounds of an airport terminal in the background. "I thought we went paperless on that last year." "Did we?" I just got a notice saying they needed verification documents. I lied smoothly. "I thought they'd be in your filing cabinet." "No, everything's digital now. Check the secure folder on our cloud drive. Username is the usual. Password is Aspen 2023 Winter." He paused. "Why aren't you answering my texts? Is everything okay?" "Just busy with the Westridge acquisition," I replied, injecting just the right amount of distraction into my voice. "You know how it is when we're in due diligence?" "Right, of course." He sounded relieved. "Listen, I'm really sorry about the anniversary. I'll make it up to you this weekend, I promise. How about that new restaurant you've been wanting to try?" "Kingsley?" "Kingston," I corrected automatically. "Sounds good. Have a safe flight." "Thanks. Love you." "You too," I replied, ending the call before emotion could creep into my voice. I immediately logged into our cloud storage with the password James had just given me. Sure enough, in the secure folder were all our insurance documents, neatly organized and labeled. But there were other folders too: tax records, property documents, and one simply labeled SP. Inside the SP folder were months of statements from Sierra Pacific Private Banking, all neatly scanned and saved. The account had been opened 9 months ago with an initial deposit of $250,000, transferred from our joint investment account. Over the following months, more transfers had followed, systematically moving our savings into this secret account. The statements also showed regular withdrawals, payments to American Express for amounts ranging from $15,000 to $30,000 per month, regular transfers to something called Oceana Properties LLC, and a recent wire transfer of $220,000 to Cartier NY. I downloaded all the statements, my mind racing. James had been systematically draining our joint accounts for 9 months, funneling everything into this secret Nevada account, and then spending lavishly on what appeared to be a second life, with Rachel Keller. But there was something else that didn't add up. Even with his substantial income from Pinnacle, James couldn't possibly afford to drain $1.2 million from our savings, spend it on a girlfriend, and maintain our current lifestyle. The math simply didn't work, unless he had another source of income. I returned to the data breach information from Kevin. The timeline matched perfectly. James began accessing Meridian's confidential acquisition data shortly after the large outflows from our joint accounts began. Was he selling Meridian's information to help fund his double life? I needed to know more about Oceana Properties LLC. A quick search revealed it was a Miami-based luxury real estate management company specializing in high-end residential leases. Their website featured the same building I'd seen in Rachel Keller's Instagram posts. It was nearly midnight now. I rubbed my eyes, exhaustion competing with the adrenaline of discovery. I needed to be clear-headed for my early meeting with Zoe tomorrow. I set my alarm for 5:30 a.m. and tried to sleep, but my mind kept returning to the evidence I'd uncovered. How had I missed this? I'd built my career on spotting financial irregularities, on seeing patterns others overlooked, yet I'd failed to notice my own husband systematically dismantling our financial future right under my nose. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by dreams of falling and of searching for lost jewelry in endless, empty safe deposit boxes. My alarm felt like it went off minutes after I'd finally fallen asleep. I showered quickly, dressed in a fresh suit I'd packed in my overnight bag, and checked out of the hotel before the morning rush began. The streets of Chicago were quiet at 6:30 a.m. as I drove to Meridian's offices. The storm had passed, leaving behind clear skies and the clean, fresh smell that follows heavy rain. It felt like a sign, clarity after chaos. Zoe was already waiting in the lobby when I arrived, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "You look like you could use this," she said, handing me one. "Rough night?" "You could say that," I replied, leading her to the elevator. "Thanks for coming in early." In my office with the door closed, I turned to Zoe. We'd worked together for 5 years, and I trusted her implicitly. Still, what I was about to share went beyond professional boundaries. "What I'm about to tell you is personal, but it may impact Meridian," I began. "I need your discretion and your help." Zoe set down her coffee, her expression serious. "Whatever you need, Morgan." I laid out what I'd discovered: the financial betrayal, the potential connection to the data breach, the suspicion that James might be selling Meridian's confidential information. Zoe's eyes widened as I spoke, but she remained silent until I finished. "That absolute bastard," she said finally. "What do you need me to do?" "I need more information about Rachel Keller and her connection to Pinnacle's clients," I replied. "And I need to understand exactly what information has been compromised at Meridian and how it might have been used." Zoe nodded, already making notes on her tablet. "I have a contact in Pinnacle's HR department. We went to business school together. She might be able to help with information about Keller." She looked up. "What about Diane? Are you going to tell her about the data breach?" "Not yet. I want more concrete evidence of the connection before I take this to her or to legal." I paused. "There's something else. I need you to help me access our trading system's historical data. I want to see if there's a pattern of trades that correlate with the breached information." "Looking for insider trading," Zoe said, understanding immediately. "If someone's been using Meridian's acquisition plans to position investments ahead of announcements..." "Exactly. And I have a feeling I know which clients might be involved." I pulled out my phone and showed her the article about Pinnacle's Miami event. I recognized several of James's biggest clients in this photo. If he's been sharing Meridian's confidential information with them, that's securities fraud, Zoe finished. "Morgan, this is serious, like FBI serious." "I know," I said quietly. "That's why I need to be absolutely certain before I take any action. For now, this stays between us." Zoe nodded solemnly. "What about your personal finances? If he's drained your savings?" "One problem at a time," I replied, though the question had been keeping me awake all night. 15 years of careful saving, of planning for our future, gone in less than a year. Right now, I need to understand the full scope of what's happening. We spent the next hour developing a plan. Zoe would reach out to her contact at Pinnacle, discreetly seeking information about Rachel Keller's client relationships. I would work with Kevin from IT to trace exactly which acquisition targets had been compromised and correlate that data with trading patterns. At 8:30, the rest of the office began to fill. I shifted into my professional role, attending meetings and reviewing reports as if nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, everything had. During a brief break between meetings, I received a text from Zoe. "Coffee in 15? Lobby cafe? Have info." When I met her in the small cafe in Meridian's lobby, her expression told me she'd found something significant. "My contact at Pinnacle came through," she said quietly, sliding into the seat across from me. "Rachel Keller was hired personally by Edward Reynolds, Pinnacle's CEO. She came with a client list from her previous firm, all high-net-worth individuals, looking for special investment opportunities." "Special how?" "The kind that consistently outperforms the market," Zoe replied meaningfully. "My contact says there are rumors that Keller's clients always seem to be positioned perfectly ahead of major market movements, especially around acquisitions and mergers." I felt a chill despite the cafe's warmth. "That sounds like insider trading," Zoe finished. "Yes. And here's where it gets interesting. Guess who brought Keller into Pinnacle?" "James," I said, already knowing the answer. Zoe nodded. They apparently worked together briefly at her previous firm in New York, before James moved to Chicago. When Reynolds was looking to expand Pinnacle's East Coast presence, James suggested bringing her on to develop their Miami office. The timeline aligned perfectly. James had made several trips to New York about a year ago, claiming he was developing new client relationships. Those trips must have been when he reconnected with Rachel. There's more, Zoe continued. Keller's client list includes 3 major investors who have made significant gains on stocks affected by Meridian's recent acquisitions. My stomach tightened. This wasn't just about James's affair anymore. This was organized securities fraud, using information stolen from my company. Kevin's finished his analysis of the compromised data, I said, lowering my voice. Every breach corresponds exactly to an acquisition target Meridian was considering. The information was accessed approximately 2 weeks before each deal became public. 2 weeks would be plenty of time to position investments, Zoe noted. This is looking less like coincidence and more like conspiracy with every new piece of information. I took a deep breath, organizing my thoughts. I need to see the trading patterns of these 3 investors. Can your contact get that information? Zoe shook her head. That would raise too many red flags. But she hesitated. There might be another way. The SEC maintains a database of unusual trading patterns. If these investors have been consistently beating the market on stocks related to Meridian's acquisitions, it would show up there. How do we access that database? I know someone who works in enforcement, Zoe said. We dated briefly last year. He might be willing to run a discreet query for me. I considered the implications. Involving someone from the SEC could escalate the situation quickly, but we needed more concrete evidence. Do it, I decided. But be careful how you frame the request. Make it hypothetical. Zoe nodded. What about James? Is he still in Denver? Supposedly, I replied. He's scheduled to return tomorrow. And when he does? I stared into my untouched coffee. I need to be strategic. If James and Keller are involved in securities fraud using Meridian's confidential information, confronting him directly could cause him to destroy evidence or flee. So what's the plan? First, we gather irrefutable evidence. Then, I paused, an idea forming. Then we use his own tactics against him. As we stood to leave, my phone buzzed with a text from James. Meeting's going well. Miss you. Looking at flights home tomorrow AM instead of PM. Can't wait to see you. I stared at the message, anger and determination crystallizing into resolve. James thought he was coming home to his unsuspecting wife, to the life he'd been, systematically undermining while building another on the side. He had no idea what was waiting for him. Back in my office, I called Diane. I need to meet with you legally. It's about a potential data breach. 2 hours later, I sat in Meridian's executive conference room with Diane, our general counsel Michael Stewart, and Kevin from IT. I had decided to share the information about the data breach without yet revealing my personal connection to it. We've discovered unauthorized access to confidential acquisition data, I explained as Kevin displayed the evidence on the screen. Someone has been using reactivated credentials to view information about potential targets before the deals become public. Michael frowned, his legal mind immediately assessing the ramifications. Where did the breach originate? IP addresses linked to Pinnacle Ventures, Kevin replied. We've traced at least 7 instances over the past 3 months. Diane's expression darkened. Pinnacle, that's James's firm, isn't it? I nodded, keeping my face professionally neutral. Yes, but we don't yet know who at Pinnacle is responsible. This is potentially very serious, Michael said, reviewing the data. If someone's using this information for trading advantages, it's securities fraud. We need to involve the authorities. I agree, I replied carefully. But before we do, I'd like 48 hours to gather more evidence. If we go to the SEC now, we risk alerting the perpetrators before we fully understand the scope of the breach. Michael and Diane exchanged glances. Hours, Diane agreed finally. But Morgan, if this involves Pinnacle, you should prepare yourself for the possibility that James might be aware of it, even if he's not directly involved. If only she knew. I understand, I said. I'll be discreet. As the meeting adjourned, my phone buzzed with a message from Zoe. My SEC contact came through. You need to see this. My office, ASAP. 5 minutes later, I was looking at trading records that confirmed my worst suspicions. 3 of Pinnacle's Miami clients, all part of Rachel Keller's portfolio, had made substantial investments in companies Meridian had targeted for acquisition just days before the information became public. The pattern was unmistakable and highly profitable. This isn't a coincidence, Zoe said. This is textbook insider trading. I stared at the evidence, the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. James had been stealing Meridian's confidential information and passing it to Rachel Keller, who used it to guide her clients' investments. The profits from those illegal trades were likely being shared, explaining how James could afford to drain our savings, maintain our lifestyle, and fund his relationship with Rachel. My husband wasn't just a cheater. He was a criminal, and he was flying home tomorrow, completely unaware that I had discovered everything. The last rays of sunset painted my office in hues of orange and gold as I methodically catalogued the extent of James's betrayal. On my desk, I had arranged 3 separate folders, financial, professional, and personal, each containing evidence of a different aspect of my husband's duplicity. You should go home, get some rest, Zoe said from the doorway, her expression concerned. She'd stayed late, helping me piece together the complex web of deception that had ensnared both my marriage and potentially my company. I can't go home, I replied, not looking up from the financial record spread before me. Not to that condo. Not tonight. Zoe nodded in understanding. My guest room is yours for as long as you need it. I finally looked up, offering her a grateful smile. Thanks. But I've already booked another night at Langford. I need space to think. Fair enough. She hesitated. Morgan, have you considered that James might be coming home early tomorrow to remove evidence? If he suspects you're on to him? The thought had already occurred to me. That's why I'm having everything documented tonight. By morning, copies of all this evidence will be secured with my attorney. After Zoe left, I turned back to my assessment. The financial damage was the easiest to quantify. I pulled out my calculator and began tabulating the losses. From our joint accounts, $1.2 million transferred to the Sierra Pacific account. From our investment portfolio, approximately $300,000 in liquidated stocks and bonds. Missing jewelry. My grandmother's sapphire earrings and pearl necklace, conservatively valued at $75,000. Total financial loss, approximately $1.575 million. I stared at the number, feeling oddly detached. 15 years of careful saving, of delayed gratification, of planning for our future, gone in less than a year. The money itself was devastating enough, but what it represented hurt even more. Every vacation we'd skipped to increase our savings, the children we'd delayed having until we were financially ready, the retirement plans we'd meticulously charted out together, all sacrificed so James could fund a luxury lifestyle with Rachel Keller. I moved to the professional folder. Here, the damage was harder to quantify, but potentially more severe. The data breach at Meridian had compromised sensitive information about at least 7 acquisition targets. If the SEC investigated and found that Meridian had failed to protect this information adequately, the company could face significant penalties. More immediately concerning was the damage to Meridian's competitive position. If details about our acquisition strategies had leaked to competitors, we could lose deals we'd spent months developing. The Westridge acquisition alone represented a potential $340 million in value to Meridian's portfolio. Then there was the potential damage to my own career. I had built my reputation at Meridian on integrity and insight. If it became known that my husband had been the source of a major security breach, would my judgment be called into question? Would the board wonder if I had been complicit or simply negligent? The personal damage was impossible to calculate. Trust broken. 15 years of shared history now called into question. Every anniversary gift, every whispered promise, every shared dream, all tainted by the knowledge of James's capacity for deception. Has any of it been real? Or had I been nothing more than a convenient cover for his ambitions, a stepping stone on his path to wherever he thought he was going? My phone buzzed with a text from James. Got an earlier flight, landing in Chicago at 10:45 a.m. Can't wait. To see you. Miss you. I set the phone down without replying. What would I even say? The Morgan he was expecting, trusting, unaware, focused on her own career while he managed their finances, no longer existed. In her place was a woman cataloging evidence for potential criminal charges. A soft knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. I looked up to see Diane standing there, concern evident in her expression. "You've been here all day," she said. "It's after 9, Morgan." I gestured to the papers spread across my desk. Just trying to understand the full scope of the data breach. Diane entered, closing the door behind her. "This isn't just about the data breach, is it?" At my surprised look, she continued. "I've known you for 5 years. I can tell when something's personal." I considered my options. Diane wasn't just my boss. She was my mentor and, increasingly, my friend. Her judgment would be crucial in the coming days. James might be involved, I finally admitted. The breach originated from Pinnacle, and I've found evidence suggesting he may have been accessing the compromised information. Diane sat down opposite me, her face gravely. "That's not what I expected. Are you certain?" "I'm gathering evidence," I replied carefully. "But it's not looking good." "And you discovered this just after your anniversary," Diane observed, connecting the dots. "Morgan, I'm so sorry." I nodded, unwilling to trust my voice with a response. "What do you need from me?" she asked after a moment. The question caught me off guard. I had expected caution, perhaps even a suggestion that I recuse myself from the investigation due to the personal connection. Instead, Diane was offering support. "Time," I answered honestly. "I need 48 hours to complete my assessment before we involve the authorities." "You have it," she agreed. "And, Morgan, whatever you discover, remember that his actions reflect on him, not on you." After Diane left, I turned back to my assessment with renewed focus. I needed to understand not just what James had done, but why, and, most importantly, how to protect myself and Meridian from further damage. I pulled up the Sierra Pacific Bank statements again, this time focusing on the outflows rather than the deposits. The patterns were revealing. Regular transfers to Oceania Properties. LLC, $18,500 per month for the past 6 months, the Miami apartment lease. American Express payments averaging $25,000 per month. Wire transfers to jewelry stores totaling approximately $340,000. A recent transfer of $120,000 to Atlantic Aviation Services. Searched Atlantic Aviation Services and discovered it was a private jet charter company based in Miami. Another luxury expense for James and Rachel's lifestyle. But there was another pattern in the statements that caught my attention. Regular deposits into the account ranging from $50,000 to $150,000. Always within days of major market movements related to Meridian's acquisition announcements. I pulled up the trading records Zoe's SEC contact had provided. 3 of Rachel Keller's clients had made substantial investments just before Meridian's acquisition targets were announced. The timing of their profits corresponded exactly with the mysterious deposits into James's Sierra Pacific account. Takao I. Picture was becoming clearer. James wasn't just stealing from our joint accounts. He was being compensated for the insider information he was providing. Rachel's clients made profitable trades based on Meridian's confidential information, and James received a percentage of those profits. It was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Securities fraud. Theft of confidential information. Potentially even corporate espionage. I reached for my phone and called Michael Stewart, Meridian's general counsel. "Morgan, everything okay?" he answered, clearly surprised by the late call. "I need to speak with you first thing tomorrow," I said without preamble. "I've found a direct connection between the data breach and potential securities fraud involving Pinnacle Ventures." "How direct?" Michael asked, his legal mind immediately assessing the liability implications. "James Edwards direct," I replied. "My husband has been accessing Meridian's acquisition data and passing it to a colleague at Pinnacle who's using it to guide client investments." The silence on the other end was profound. "I'll be in at 7, Michael said finally. "My office." After ending the call, I gathered the most critical evidence into a single file and emailed it to myself at a new, secure address I'd created earlier that day. Then, I called a 24-hour courier service and arranged for physical copies to be delivered to my personal attorney's office before morning. Finally, I began preparing for my conversation with Michael. The legal ramifications of what I'd discovered were complex and potentially far-reaching. Meridian needed to report the breach to the SEC, but the timing and manner of that report would be crucial. As I drove to the Langford Hotel shortly after 10 p.m., my mind continued to assess the damage. Beyond the financial loss and professional complications, there was the practical matter of where I would live. The condo was in both our names, but I couldn't imagine continuing to stay there, surrounded by memories of a relationship that had been built on deception. In my hotel room, I kicked off my heels and poured myself a glass of water from the bathroom sink, avoiding the minibar. I needed clarity, not comfort. My phone buzzed with yet another text from James. "Everything okay? You're not responding to messages. Flight confirmed for tomorrow morning. We need to talk about something important when I get home." That last line sent a chill through me. What important topic did James suddenly need to discuss? Had he somehow discovered that I was investigating him? Or was this about something else entirely? I set the phone down without replying and turned back to my notes. There was another aspect of the damage I needed to assess: the future implications. If James had been involved in securities fraud and the evidence became public, his career would be over. He would likely face criminal charges, potentially even prison time. While part of me felt he deserved whatever consequences came his way, another part recognized that his actions would have lasting repercussions for me as well. Financial recovery would take years. My professional reputation might be tarnished, by association, regardless of my innocence. And then there was the emotional toll, the trust issues, the second-guessing, the inevitable questions about what I might have missed or ignored. I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began making a new list: protection strategy. Secure all evidence. Consult with personal attorney Re. Financial protection. Separate finances completely. Secure new living arrangements. Develop disclosure strategy. With Meridian Legal, prepare for potential SEC investigation. Assess career implications. And options. As I reviewed the list, a new thought occurred to me. The damage James had done was substantial, but it also presented an opportunity. In the corporate world, crises often led to restructuring, the removal of compromised elements, and the strengthening of what remained. Perhaps my personal life could follow a similar pattern. I added a new item to my list. 8. Identify leverage. Points for negotiation. James had spent our life savings on his mistress. He had potentially committed crimes that could lead to prison time. He had betrayed not just me personally, but my professional world as well. What leverage did that give me? I thought about Meridian's position. The company needed to address the data breach quickly and decisively to minimize reputational damage. If James was indeed selling confidential information to benefit Pinnacle's clients, both firms would be implicated in the scandal. Unless a new possibility began to form in my mind. What if there was a way to protect Meridian while simultaneously ensuring James faced consequences for his actions? What if I could leverage this crisis into an opportunity? I picked up my phone and sent a text to Diane. Need to discuss crisis. Management options tomorrow are a data breach. Have a potential solution that minimizes public damage. Her reply came almost immediately. My office, 8 a.m. I set down the phone and turned back to my assessment. The damage James had done was extensive, but not irreparable. With the right strategy, I could not only recover but potentially emerge stronger. My thoughts were interrupted by the hotel room phone. The front desk was calling. Ms. Edwards? There's a gentleman in the lobby asking to see you. He says he's your husband. My heart raced. James was supposed to be in Denver until tomorrow morning. Had he lied about that too? Did he say why he's here? I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. No, ma'am. He just says it's urgent. I took a deep breath, considering my options. I wasn't ready for this confrontation. Not yet, not before I'd secured all the evidence and spoken with Michael and Diane. Please tell him I'm not available, I said finally, and I'm not accepting visitors. Yes, ma'am. After hanging up, I moved to the window and carefully peered down at the street below. Sure enough, James's Tesla was parked in the hotel's circular drive. As I watched, he emerged from the lobby, phone in hand, looking frustrated. My own phone buzzed seconds later. Morgan, I know you're at Langford. We need to talk. Now. How had he found me? I had used my personal credit card, not our joint one. Then I remembered. James had set up tracking on our phones last year, supposedly for safety. I'd never thought to disable it. I turned off my phone, completely, and moved away from the window. This changed things. If James knew I was investigating him, he might try to destroy evidence or move money beyond my reach. I needed to accelerate my timeline. Using the hotel room's landline, I called Michael Stewart again. Morgan? What's going on? He answered, clearly concerned by the second late-night call. James knows I'm investigating him, I said without preamble. He's at my hotel right now, trying to confront me. We need to secure all evidence immediately, and potentially involve the SEC sooner than we discussed. Where are you? Michael asked. The Langford, room 1142. Stay there, lock your door. I'm calling our security team and heading over. Don't engage with him. After hanging up with Michael, I called Zoe. James is here, I said when she answered. He knows something's wrong. Can you check if any of the evidence is being accessed or modified from his account? On it, she replied immediately. I'll call Kevin in IT. We'll lock down all the files remotely. I hung up and took a moment to steady myself. This wasn't how I had planned for the confrontation to happen. I had wanted to be fully prepared, with all evidence secured and legal counsel present. Now James had forced my hand. My hotel room phone rang again. Ms. Edwards? I'm sorry to bother you again, but your husband is insisting on speaking with you. He says it's a matter of financial security. Financial security. The irony would have been amusing if the situation weren't so serious. Please tell him that if he's concerned about financial security, he should check the Sierra Pacific account, I replied, deciding to let him know I was aware of at least part of his deception. And if he doesn't leave immediately, the hotel should call security. There was a pause on the other end. Yes, ma'am. I'll convey your message. From my window, I watched as James received the message. Even from 15 floors up, I could see his face pale. He looked up at the hotel as if trying to determine which window was mine, then got into his car and drove away. The confrontation had been delayed, But now James knew that I had discovered at least some of his deception. The next 24 hours would be critical. I turned my attention back to assessing the damage and planning my response. If James was panicking, he might make mistakes. Mistakes I could use to my advantage. My hotel room phone rang once more. "Ms. Edwards? Michael Stewart from Meridian Dynamics is here with 2 security officers. Please send them up." Minutes later, Michael entered my room, accompanied by 2 men in suits who introduced themselves as Meridian's head of security and a digital forensics specialist. "Are you all right?" Michael asked, his usually composed expression concerned. "I'm fine," I assured him. "But James knows I've discovered something. He may try to destroy evidence or move assets." "We're already on it," Michael replied. "Our team is securing all digital evidence related to the data breach. We've also notified building security at Meridian to deny James access if he attempts to enter." The forensics specialist, Dave, spoke up. "Ms. Edwards, we need to access your devices to document the evidence you've gathered and secure it properly." I handed over my laptop, relieved to have professional support. While Dave worked, Michael and I discussed next steps. "We need to file an initial report with the SEC," Michael advised. "If James is involved in securities fraud using Meridian's information, we need to demonstrate that we took immediate action once we became aware." "Agreed," I replied. "But there's something else to consider. This isn't just about James. If Rachel Keller and her clients at Pinnacle have been profiting from Meridian's confidential information, the entire firm could be implicated." Michael nodded grimly. "Which could create a PR nightmare for both companies and potentially impact market confidence in firms managed by either." "Exactly. So we need a strategy that contains the damage." I hesitated, then shared the idea that had been forming in my mind. "What if we position this as the actions of 2 rogue employees rather than systemic corruption?" Michael considered. That could work, but only if we can demonstrate that Meridian took decisive action immediately upon discovery and implemented new safeguards to prevent future breaches. And if Pinnacle cooperates by doing the same," I added, "which means we need leverage with their CEO, Edward Reynolds." A thoughtful expression crossed Michael's face. "You're thinking several moves ahead, aren't you?" "I have to be," I replied. "This isn't just about professional damage control, it's personal too." As the forensics team worked to secure the digital evidence, I continued my assessment of the total damage James had caused. The financial losses were substantial, but quantifiable. The professional implications were complex, but manageable with the right strategy. The personal toll was immeasurable. But as I watched Meridian's team mobilize to protect the company's interests that aligned with my own, I began to see how this crisis might be transformed into an opportunity. James had underestimated me, both personally and professionally. He'd assumed I was too trusting, too focused on my own work to notice his deception. That miscalculation would be his downfall, and possibly my path to an unexpected future. Dawn broke over Chicago, painting the skyline in soft pinks and golds as I stood at my hotel window, watching the city come to life. I hadn't slept much. Michael and the security team had stayed until after 2 a.m., securing evidence and developing an initial response strategy. Now, with 3 hours of fitful sleep behind me, I was preparing for a day that would determine the course of my future. My phone, which I'd turned back on after James left, buzzed with a message from Zoe. It confirmed all files secure, no deletions or modifications from James's accounts, but he tried to access the system at 4:13 a.m., failed due to emergency protocol lockout. So James was already attempting to cover his tracks. His appearance at the hotel last night hadn't been a coincidence. Something had tipped him off about my investigation. A second message came through, this one from my personal attorney, Sophia Ramirez. Received documents. Reviewed preliminary evidence. Available to meet at 7:30 a.m. I texted back a confirmation and began preparing for the day. As I showered and dressed, I mentally reviewed the list of people I needed to consult, each offering a different perspective, and expertise that I would need to navigate the complicated situation ahead. First, Sophia for legal protection of my personal interests. Then Michael and Diane at Meridian for the corporate response strategy. Later, I would need to speak with my financial advisor about securing what assets remained and planning for recovery. But there was someone else I needed to talk to first, someone whose insight was unclouded by professional obligations or legal considerations. I picked up my phone and called the one person who had known me longer than anyone else in Chicago. Morgan? My brother's voice was immediately concerned despite the early hour. Everything okay? Not really, Eric, I admitted. I need your advice. Can I come by before work? Of course. I'll put on coffee. 45 minutes later, I sat at my brother's kitchen table in his Wicker Park apartment, cradling a mug of strong coffee between my hands. Eric had listened without interrupting as I outlined the situation, his expression growing increasingly grim. That absolute bastard. He said when I finished, echoing Zoe's reaction from the day before. I never liked him, you know. I smiled weakly. You never like anyone I date. And I'm usually right. Eric's protective streak had been both a comfort and an annoyance throughout my life. As my older brother by just 18 months, he'd appointed himself my guardian from childhood, a role he never quite outgrew even after I'd proven myself perfectly capable of independence. Not helping, Eric, he sighed, running a hand through his dark hair, the same shade as mine, one of several traits we shared along with our mother's green eyes and our father's analytical mind. What do you need from me, Morgan? Just say the word. I considered the question carefully. Honesty. No legal strategies or professional considerations. Just, what would you do if you were me? Eric leaned back in his chair, studying me. As a trauma surgeon at Chicago Memorial, he was accustomed to making quick, difficult decisions under pressure. It was one of the reasons I valued his perspective, even when I disagreed with it. I'd burn it all down, he said finally. File for divorce immediately, press criminal charges, make sure everyone knows exactly what he did. That's the emotional response, I noted, not the strategic one. Strategy is overrated. Sometimes the direct approach is best. I shook my head. If I just expose everything immediately, it creates maximum damage for everyone, including me and Meridian. There has to be a better way. Eric's expression softened. That's always been the difference between us. You see chess moves, I see someone who deserves to be punched. He paused. But you're right. If your goal is more than just making him pay, you need a different approach. My goal is protection and recovery, I clarified. For myself and for Meridian. But also, I hesitated, not quite ready to articulate the idea that had been forming in my mind. Also what? Eric prompted. Justice, I said finally. Not revenge, but real consequences that match the harm he caused. Eric nodded slowly. Then you need to be calculating, not emotional. Use everything you know about him. His weaknesses, his ambitions, his fears. What would really hurt James isn't public humiliation, I said, thinking aloud. It's a loss of status and control. He cares about his position, his reputation in financial circles. So target that, Eric suggested. Find a way to take control of what he values most. Our conversation continued as the morning light strengthened, illuminating the strategic possibilities that lay before me. Eric didn't offer specific plans. His world of emergency medicine was far removed from corporate finance, but his perspective helped clarify my thinking. Whatever you decide, he said as I prepared to leave for my meeting with Sophia. I'm here. Spare bedroom is yours for as long as you need it, though I suspect my modest apartment isn't quite what you're used to. I hugged him tightly. Thanks. I might take you up on that, at least temporarily. And Morgan? He added as I reached the door. Dad would be proud of how you're handling this. Mom, too. The mention of our parents. Both gone now. My father to cancer 5 years ago. My mother, to a stroke just last year, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. I merely nodded, not trusting my voice, and headed out to face the day. Sofia Ramirez's office was located in a renovated industrial building in the West Loop, its exposed brick walls and steel beams contrasting with the sleek, modern furniture. I hired Sofia 3 years ago to review my employment contract with Meridian, impressed by her reputation for fierce advocacy tempered with practical advice. The evidence is compelling, she said now, closing the folder containing the documents I'd sent over last night. Both for divorce proceedings and potential criminal charges. I'm less concerned about criminal charges right now and more focused on protecting what's left of my assets, I replied. James has already moved most of our savings. I need to make sure he can't access anything else. Sofia nodded, making notes. We'll file emergency motions to freeze all remaining joint accounts and bar disposition of joint property. That includes your condo. He can have the condo, I said dismissively. I'm not going back there. Nevertheless, it's an asset that needs to be protected during divorce proceedings. Sofia looked up from her notes. Morgan, have you considered that James might try to claim he was investing those funds, not stealing them? That the Nevada account was a legitimate financial strategy? I had considered it. The payments to Cartier and Atlantic Aviation would dispute that claim, as would the Miami apartment for his girlfriend. True, but financial cases can get messy. Judges have seen it all. Sofia leaned forward. What we need is irrefutable evidence of intent to deprive you of marital assets permanently. Like what? Communications, emails, texts, anything showing he intended to leave you or hide these assets from you permanently. I thought about the notebook I'd found in James's desk, with its cryptic notations about payments to RK. I have some physical evidence, but nothing explicit in writing. Then we need more, Sofia said decisively. The securities fraud angle complicates things. Once the SEC gets involved, evidence gathering becomes more difficult. Meridian's filing. An initial report with the SEC this morning, I informed her. But we're positioning it as an isolated breach rather than systemic fraud, at least initially. Sofia considered this. Smart. Buys you time to gather more evidence. She paused. But Morgan, you need to be prepared. This will become public. Eventually. Securities fraud involving 2 major financial firms? The press will be all over it. The thought made my stomach tighten. I'd always valued my privacy, keeping a deliberate separation between my professional and personal lives. Now that boundary would be obliterated. How do I minimize the personal exposure? I asked. Control the narrative, Sofia advised. Position yourself as the whistleblower who discovered the fraud, not the wife who was deceived. Focus on your professional actions, not your personal relationship. It was solid advice, aligning with the strategy I'd begun to formulate. There's something else, I said, deciding to share the idea that had been developing since last night. I'm considering a different approach than just divorce and criminal charges. Sofia raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. What if there was a way to protect Meridian, recover my financial losses, and ensure James faces appropriate consequences, all without a public scandal? Sounds too good to be true, Sofia remarked skeptically. It depends on leverage, I explained. James and Rachel have put Pinnacle in an extremely vulnerable position. If Edward Reynolds, their CEO, understands the extent of that vulnerability, he might be open to a negotiated solution. Understanding dawned in Sofia's eyes. You're thinking of using the threat of exposure to force a private settlement. More than that, I admitted. I'm thinking of restructuring. Sofia leaned back in her chair, studying me with new interest. That's ambitious, and potentially very effective if you can pull it off. She reached for her legal pad. Let's talk. Specifics. For the next hour, we outlined a strategy that went beyond conventional legal remedies, one that would require careful coordination and precise timing. By the time I left for my meeting at Meridian, I had not just legal counsel, but a potential pathway to justice that aligned with both my personal and professional interests. Meridian's offices were buzzing with unusual activity when I arrived. Security personnel I didn't recognize were stationed near the executive floor, and I noticed Kevin from IT leading a team of technicians through the server room. Diane and Michael were waiting in the conference room, along with Robert Harrison, and two people I recognized as outside counsel Meridian used for regulatory matters. Morgan, Diane greeted me, her expression a carefully controlled mix of concern and resolve. How are you holding up? I'm focused, I replied truthfully, and ready to address this situation. Robert Harrison looked less sympathetic. This is an unprecedented breach of security, he stated, his tone making it clear he considered me at least partially responsible by association. The potential damage to Meridian's reputation is precisely why we need to handle this strategically rather than reactively, I interrupted smoothly, which is why I've developed a comprehensive approach that protects Meridian while ensuring all responsible parties are held accountable. That caught Harrison's attention. You have a plan already? I do. I set my portfolio on the table and took a seat. But before I outline it, I need to be clear about something. While I am deeply disturbed by my husband's potential involvement, in this situation, I discovered and reported it immediately upon finding evidence. My loyalty is to Meridian. Diane nodded approvingly. No one in this room questions your integrity, Morgan. I glanced at Harrison, whose expression suggested he might indeed have such questions, but he remained silent. Our immediate priority is containing the data breach and reporting appropriately to the SEC, Michael began, shifting the focus to action steps. We've already implemented emergency security protocols and engaged forensic specialists to document everything. One of the outside attorneys, a sharp-featured woman named Patricia Mills, spoke up. We've drafted an initial disclosure for the SEC that reports the breach without specifying individuals involved. This buys us time to complete our internal investigation before names become public. What about Pinnacle? Harrison demanded. They're clearly implicated in this. That's where my strategy comes in, I said, opening my portfolio. We need to approach this as a negotiation, not just an investigation. All eyes turned to me as I outlined my proposal. A coordinated approach that would involve Meridian, Pinnacle's leadership, and carefully calibrated legal pressure points. So rather than immediate public disclosure naming James and Rachel Keller, you're suggesting we privately approach Edward Reynolds with evidence of what his employees have done? Michael summarized when I'd finished. Exactly. Reynolds has every incentive to cooperate. A public securities fraud scandal involving his firm could destroy Pinnacle. He'll want to contain the damage as much as we do. And you believe he'll agree to your proposal? Restructuring? Diane asked carefully. I believe he'll see it as the only viable option once he understands the alternatives. Harrison frowned. This seems unnecessarily complicated. Why not just report everything to the SEC and let the justice system handle it? Because that approach maximizes damage to all parties, I explained patiently, including Meridian. The market doesn't distinguish well between companies involved in fraud and companies victimized by it. We'd all suffer reputational damage. She's right, Patricia Mills interjected. I've handled enough securities cases to know that public exposure is rarely clean or precise. The mud tends to stick to everyone involved. Discussion continued, with questions raised about legal implications, timing, and potential pitfalls. I had answers ready, having thought through each aspect methodically. What about your personal stake in this? Harrison asked finally, addressing the elephant in the room. You can't possibly be objective about your husband's involvement. I met his gaze steadily. My personal stake is precisely why this will work. James believes he knows me. Believes I'll react emotionally rather than strategically. That miscalculation gives us an advantage. Diane studied me for a long moment, then nodded decisively. I support Morgan's approach. It protects Meridian's interests while ensuring accountability. As does legal, Michael added. Harrison looked like he wanted to argue further, but conceded, with a curt nod. Fine, but I want daily updates, and if anything suggests this strategy isn't working, we pivot immediately to full disclosure. Agreed, I said. As the meeting adjourned, Diane asked me to stay behind. When we were alone, she closed the conference room door and turned to me with concern evident in her expression. You're handling this with remarkable composure, she observed. But I need to know, are you really okay? The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on strategy and action steps that I'd barely allowed myself to process the emotional reality of the situation. I'm functioning, I replied honestly. That's what matters right now. Diane shook her head slightly. What matters is that you have support. This isn't just a corporate crisis for you, Morgan. It's your life. Something in her tone, genuine concern without pity, broke through the professional facade I'd been maintaining. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I'm angry, I admitted quietly, and hurt, and honestly, a little ashamed that I didn't see what was happening sooner. But mostly, I'm determined. James doesn't get to destroy what I've built. Not my career, not my financial security, not my self-respect. Diane nodded, understanding in her eyes. Good. Channel that determination. And remember, you're not facing this alone. Thank you. The words were simple but sincere. Now, Diane continued, her tone shifting back to professional. Let's talk about your next steps. You're proposing to approach Edward Reynolds directly? Yes. I already have a meeting scheduled for 2 p.m. today. Diane's eyebrows rose in surprise. How did you manage that so quickly? I called in a favor, I explained. A former Meridian executive who now sits on Pinnacle's board. I told him it was a matter of extreme urgency regarding potential regulatory concerns. Impressive, Diane acknowledged. But also risky. Reynolds could react defensively. He could, I agreed, but I don't think he will. Not once he sees the evidence. After leaving Diane, I made my way to Zoe's office. She looked up from her computer as I entered, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she'd had as little sleep as I had. I have the additional financial records you requested, she said, handing me a folder. And I've compiled profiles on Edward Reynolds and Pinnacle's board members. I took the folder gratefully. You're a lifesaver. Just doing my job, Zoe replied with a small smile. Though I have to admit, this goes beyond normal job duties. I know, and I won't forget it. So you're really going to confront the CEO of Pinnacle? Zoe asked, lowering her voice despite the closed door. That's bold. Not confront. Negotiate. I opened the folder, scanning the profile of Edward Reynolds. Harvard Business School, 20 years at Goldman Sachs before founding. Pinnacle, reputation for ruthless efficiency balanced with impeccable ethics. Reynolds built Pinnacle on a foundation of trust and integrity. That's his public brand. He can't afford to have it tarnished by a securities fraud scandal. And you're going to use that to your advantage. I'm going to offer him a solution that protects what he values while ensuring justice is served. I closed the folder. It's what I do, Zoe. Restructuring. Zoe studied me with a mixture of concern and admiration. Just be careful. James already knows something's wrong. If he realizes you're meeting with his boss, he won't, I assured her. The meeting is off-site, and Reynolds has been told this is a confidential regulatory matter. I spent the next 2 hours preparing for my meeting with Reynolds, reviewing the evidence one more time and refining my approach. I ordered lunch to be delivered to my office, not wanting to risk running into colleagues who might ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. At 1:30, I left Meridian for the private dining room, at Gibson's where I'd arranged to meet Reynolds. As my car navigated through Chicago's busy streets, I received a text from James. "We need to talk. Things aren't what they seem. Please come home tonight." I stared at the message, noting the shift in tone from his earlier texts. No longer casual or affectionate, but urgent and defensive. James was worried. Good. I didn't reply. Instead, I focused on centering myself for what might be the most consequential meeting of my life. I wasn't approaching Reynolds as a betrayed wife seeking retribution, but as a financial executive proposing a solution to a critical problem, a solution that would transform James's betrayal into an opportunity I never could have anticipated. As the car pulled up to Gibson's, I checked my reflection in my compact mirror. The woman looking back at me wasn't broken or defeated. She was determined, focused, and absolutely clear about what needed to happen next. I stepped out of the car, straightened my suit jacket, and walked into the restaurant where Edward Reynolds was waiting. It was time to set my plan in motion. Gibson's private dining room exudes old-world power, dark mahogany paneling, strategically dim lighting, and absolute discretion. Edward Reynolds was already seated when I arrived, a glass of water untouched, before him. At 62, he maintained the sharp alertness that had made him legendary in financial circles. His silver hair was impeccably styled, his bespoke suit speaking of wealth that valued quality over ostentation. "Ms. Edwards," he greeted me, standing as I entered. His handshake was firm, his expression guarded. "This is certainly an unusual request for a meeting." "I appreciate you accommodating it, Mr. Reynolds," I replied, taking the seat across from him, "particularly on such short notice." Alan Prescott implied it was a matter of some urgency regarding regulatory concerns. Reynolds studied me carefully, though he was surprisingly light on details. For good reason. I placed my portfolio on the table but didn't open it immediately. "What I'm about to share with you requires absolute discretion and careful consideration." A server appeared, offering drinks. I declined, as did Reynolds. Once we were alone again, he leaned forward slightly. "I prefer directness, Ms. Edwards. What exactly is this about?" "It's about a significant securities fraud operation being conducted through Pinnacle Ventures," I stated, watching his expression closely. "One that uses Meridian's confidential acquisition data to guide client investment strategies." Reynolds's face remained impressively neutral, though I detected a slight tightening around his eyes. "That's an extraordinary claim, with extraordinary evidence to support it." I opened my portfolio and removed the first document, a summary of the data breach at Meridian, with specific dates and times. For the past 3 months, someone has been accessing Meridian's confidential acquisition data using reactivated credentials. The access originates from Pinnacle's IP addresses. Reynolds glanced at the document but didn't touch it. A concerning allegation, but hardly proof of securities fraud. Agreed. I placed a second document beside the first, trading records showing suspicious patterns. However, when combined with these trading records showing multiple Pinnacle clients making significant investments in Meridian's acquisition targets just before public announcements, the picture becomes clearer. A muscle twitches in Reynolds's jaw. These trading patterns could be coincidental. They could be, I acknowledged, if they occurred once or twice, but 7 times in 3 months, with the same clients, all managed by the same Pinnacle advisor? The statistical probability of coincidence approaches 0. I laid out the next document, a timeline correlating the data breaches with the suspicious trades and subsequent profits. "And who exactly are you suggesting is responsible for this correlation?" Reynolds asked, his tone carefully controlled. This was the moment of truth. I met his gaze directly. Rachel Keller and James Edwards. Reynolds didn't flinch, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or confirmation of a suspicion he already harbored. "You're making serious accusations about 2 of my employees," he said after a moment. "One of whom is your husband." "Yes." "Which raises questions about your motivations, Ms. Edwards." I had anticipated this objection. "My primary motivation is protecting Meridian from further damage. My personal relationship with James Edwards is precisely why I'm approaching you privately rather than going directly to the SEC. And why would I believe you're not simply a scorned wife looking for revenge?" I placed the final document on the table. A copy of the Sierra Pacific bank statements showing the systematic draining of my joint accounts with James, followed by lavish expenditures including payments for Rachel Keller's Miami apartment. "Because a scorned wife would have already filed criminal charges and contacted the Wall Street Journal," I replied evenly. "I'm here because I recognize that a public scandal serves no one's interests, not Meridian's, not Pinnacle's, and truthfully, not mine." Reynolds finally reached for the documents, reviewing them with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades evaluating financial information. I remained silent, allowing him time to absorb the implications. "Even if these allegations are true," he said finally, "why come to me instead of the authorities? Because I believe in targeted solutions rather than scorched earth approaches." I leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Reynolds, you've spent 20 years building Pinnacle's reputation for integrity. One securities fraud scandal involving your employees could undermine that entirely, regardless of whether you were aware of their actions. And Meridian faces similar risks," Reynolds observed, demonstrating he understood the stakes perfectly. "Precisely, which is why I'm proposing an alternative approach." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "A strategic restructuring that addresses the immediate issue while preventing market disruption or reputational damage to either firm." I outlined my proposal, a carefully crafted solution that would require Reynolds' cooperation, but would ultimately protect Pinnacle's institutional reputation while ensuring the individuals responsible faced appropriate consequences. When I finished, Reynolds was silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he spoke. "Your proposal is unconventional, but effective," I pointed out, "and far preferable to the alternative of public exposure." "Perhaps." Reynolds gathered the documents and handed them back to me. "I'll need time to verify these allegations independently." "Of course, but not too much time." I accepted the documents. Meridian is legally obligated to disclose the data breach to the SEC. We've filed an initial report that doesn't name specific individuals, but full disclosure will be necessary within 10 business days. "I understand the timeline." Reynolds stood, signaling the end of our meeting. "I'll be in touch within 48 hours, Ms. Edwards." As I left Gibson's, I felt a curious mixture of tension and relief. Reynolds hadn't committed to anything, but he hadn't dismissed my allegations either. More importantly, he had recognized the wisdom of handling this situation discreetly rather than defensively. Back in my car, I checked my phone to find 3 missed calls and 4 text messages from James. The latest one read, "Morgan, this is serious. There are things happening you don't understand. We need to talk. I'm at the condo waiting." I didn't reply. Instead, I called Zoe. "How did it go?" she asked immediately. As expected, Reynolds is concerned but cautious. He'll investigate independently before responding. And if he finds evidence confirming everything, then he'll have to make a choice between protecting his firm's reputation or defending employees who have engaged in securities fraud. I glanced out the window as my driver navigated through downtown Chicago. It's not really a choice at all. "What about James? Any contact?" "Multiple attempts," I replied. "He's getting desperate." "Be careful," Zoe warned. "Desperate people make unpredictable moves." After ending the call with Zoe, I directed my driver to take me to the Langford Hotel rather than back to Meridian. I needed time to prepare for my next steps, particularly if Reynolds decided to cooperate. In my hotel room, I reviewed everything that had happened over the past 48 hours, looking for any vulnerabilities in my strategy. Reynolds was the key. If he recognized the threat to Pinnacle and chose to cooperate, everything else would fall into place. If not, I would need to proceed with the more conventional approach of full disclosure to the SEC and legal action against James personally. My phone rang, Diane calling from Meridian. "Morgan, we need you back at the office," she said when I answered. "Something's happened." "What is it?" "James showed up here demanding to see you. Security refused him entry as instructed, but he made quite a scene. And now Robert Harrison is asking questions about why your husband is being barred from the building." I closed my eyes, briefly. "Tell Harrison it's a security precaution related to the data breach investigation. I'll be there in 20 minutes. When I arrived at Meridian, I found Michael Stewart waiting for me in the lobby, his expression concerned. "James left about 10 minutes ago," he informed me as we walked toward the elevator. "But he was agitated. Said he needed to warn you about something." "Did he elaborate?" Michael shook his head. "Just kept insisting it was urgent and personal. When security refused to let him up, he threatened to call you directly about something called Project Helios." I stopped walking. "He specifically mentioned Project Helios?" "Yes." "Does that mean something to you?" It did, but not in the way James had likely intended. Project Helios was Meridian's code name for a potential acquisition of Suntech Industries, a renewable energy company we'd been evaluating for the past month. The deal was still in early stages, with only the executive team and board aware of the details. "It's a confidential acquisition target," I explained to Michael. "One that would have been included in the data James accessed." Michael's expression darkened. "So he's essentially confirming he has confidential information by using that name." "Exactly, though I doubt he realized what he was revealing." That slip was significant. By explicitly mentioning Project Helios, James had provided direct evidence connecting him to the data breach, evidence that would be documented in Meridian's security logs since multiple witnesses had heard him. As we rode the elevator to the executive floor, I contemplated this unexpected development. James's desperation was making him careless, which worked to my advantage. But it also made him potentially more volatile. Diane was waiting in her office, along with Robert Harrison, whose expression suggested he was rapidly losing patience with the situation. "Would someone please explain why we're treating James Edwards like a security threat?" Harrison demanded as soon as I entered. "He's been a valuable partner to Meridian for years." I exchanged glances with Diane, who nodded slightly, giving me permission to share more details with Harrison. "James is directly implicated in the data breach we're investigating," I stated simply. "We have evidence suggesting he's been accessing confidential acquisition data and potentially sharing it with clients at Pinnacle." Harrison's expression shifted from irritation to shock. Are you certain?" "Increasingly so," I replied, "particularly after his visit today, where he explicitly referenced Project Helios, information he should have no knowledge of." The implications registered immediately with Harrison. "My God, if he's been sharing information about our acquisition targets, it would constitute securities fraud," Michael confirmed, "which is why we've implemented security protocols preventing his access to our building and systems." Harrison turned to me, his expression now conflicted. "Morgan, I don't know what to say. This must be extremely difficult for you personally." The sympathy was unexpected from Harrison, who typically kept discussions strictly professional. "My priority is protecting Meridian," I replied, "which is why I've already met with Edward Reynolds at Pinnacle to discuss a coordinated response." "You've met with Reynolds?" Harrison's surprise was evident. "Without board authorization? As head of strategic restructuring, identifying and addressing threats to Meridian's operations falls within my purview, I pointed out. I kept Michael and Diane informed of my approach. Both nodded in confirmation, presenting a united front that Harrison couldn't easily challenge. Fine, he conceded, but I want a full briefing for the board tomorrow morning. This situation is escalating too quickly for comfort. After Harrison left, Diane closed her office door and turned to me. What did Reynolds say? He's cautious, but concerned. He'll investigate independently and respond within 48 hours. And if he confirms your allegations? Then we implement the restructuring strategy we discussed. Michael looked thoughtful. James coming here today, and specifically mentioning Project Helios, strengthens our position considerably. It's recorded in our security logs and witnessed by multiple people. It does, I agreed. Though I'm concerned about what it says about his state of mind. James is getting desperate, which makes him unpredictable. Where are you staying tonight? Diane asked. Not at your condo, I hope. The Langford. And I've instructed hotel security not to allow James access. Good. Diane paused. There's something else you should know. One of our board members received a call from a friend at the SEC this afternoon. They're asking questions about unusual trading patterns related to our recent acquisitions. This was an unexpected complication. The SEC is already investigating? Preliminarily, Michael clarified. Standard monitoring algorithms probably flagged the trading patterns. It doesn't necessarily mean they're focusing on Meridian or Pinnacle specifically yet. But it accelerates our timeline, I noted. If the SEC is already asking questions, we need Reynolds' cooperation sooner rather than later. Back in my office, I found Zoe waiting with what appeared to be more documents. You need to see this, she said, closing the door behind me. Kevin found something else in the server logs. She handed me a printout showing access logs for a different section of Meridian's database, employee records and compensation data. Someone accessed your personal employment file 2 days ago, Zoe explained, using the same compromised credentials that were used to view the acquisition data. I studied the logs, noting the timestamp, 6:42 p.m., after normal business hours. What exactly did they access? I asked. Your employment contract, compensation records, and performance reviews. Basically, everything related to your position and authority at Meridian. This was puzzling. Why would James be interested in my employment details? Unless he was looking for vulnerabilities, I realized aloud. Ways to potentially discredit me or undermine my position if I discovered what he was doing. That's my guess, Zoe agreed. Classic preemptive strategy. Know your opponent's weaknesses before they become your adversary. Except he didn't find any vulnerabilities, I noted, reviewing the access logs again. My performance reviews have been consistently outstanding, and my contract is bulletproof. Sophia made sure of that. Actually, there might be something even more interesting here, Zoe said, pointing to another section of the logs. After viewing your files, he accessed board meeting minutes from last month, the ones where they discussed the leadership transition plan. I felt a chill of realization. Meridian's longtime CEO, Lawrence Bennett, was planning to retire within the next year. The board had been quietly evaluating potential successors from within the executive team. I was one of 3 candidates being considered, something not widely known outside the board and executive committee. He was looking for leverage, I said slowly. Information he could potentially use against me if necessary. But what James had found instead might actually be the leverage point I needed, a way to transform his betrayal into an unexpected opportunity. My phone rang, displaying an unfamiliar number with a Chicago area code. I answered cautiously. Morgan Edwards. Ms. Edwards, this is Edward Reynolds. His voice was crisp, urgent. I've conducted some preliminary inquiries into the information you shared with me. And, I prompted when he paused. I'd like to meet again, tonight, if possible. Same location, 8 p.m.? I'll be there. After ending the call, I turned to Zoe. Reynolds wants to meet again tonight. He's found something. That was fast, Zoe observed. What do you think he discovered? Something that confirms my allegations, and probably something worse. I spent the next 2 hours preparing for the meeting, reviewing all the evidence once more, and refining my proposal to Reynolds. I also called Sophia to update her on the developments. The SEC inquiries change things, she noted after I explained the situation. If they're already asking questions about trading patterns, this could move from fraud to full-scale regulatory investigation very quickly, which gives Reynolds even more incentive to cooperate with my proposal, I pointed out. True, but it also increases pressure on all parties. Be prepared for him to try to negotiate terms. When I arrived at Gibson's that evening, I was shown to a different private dining room, one even more secluded than before. Reynolds was already there, along with a woman I recognized as Patricia Alvarez, Pinnacle's general counsel. Ms. Edwards, Reynolds greeted me, his expression grim. This is Patricia Alvarez, our chief legal officer. I know who Ms. Alvarez is, I replied, nodding to the attorney. Her reputation precedes her. As does yours, Alvarez responded coolly, particularly your skill in restructuring troubled situations. I took a seat across from them. I take it. Your preliminary inquiries yielded concerning results. Reynolds exchanged glances with Alvarez, who nodded slightly. We've confirmed that Rachel Keller and James Edwards have been engaging in highly irregular activities, Reynolds stated carefully. Ms. Keller's client trading patterns show statistically impossible success rates around specific corporate events that match precisely with Meridian's acquisition targets. And James? I prompted. We've discovered communications between them discussing what they refer to as special insight opportunities for select clients. Reynolds pushed a folder across the table. These were recovered from Pinnacle's secure messaging system. I opened the folder to find printouts of messages between James and Rachel, carefully worded, but clearly referencing advanced knowledge of market-moving events. More damning was a message where Rachel specifically mentioned that Helios project Morgan's team is evaluating and asking when it would be announced publicly. There's more, Alvarez said, her tone professionally detached despite the seriousness of the situation. We've found evidence of significant payments to Mr. Edwards from specific client accounts, payments structured as consulting fees, but with no documented consulting services provided. Kickbacks, I translated. Essentially, Reynolds confirmed. We believe Ms. Keller's clients were compensating Mr. Edwards for the confidential information he provided, with Ms. Keller serving as the intermediary. This explained the mysterious deposits into James's Sierra Pacific account. He wasn't just stealing our savings, he was being paid to commit securities fraud. The situation is obviously untenable, Reynolds continued. Pinnacle cannot and will not tolerate this kind of behavior. Both Ms. Keller and Mr. Edwards will be terminated immediately. That's a start, I acknowledged. But termination alone doesn't address the broader implications, particularly with the SEC already asking questions about trading patterns related to Meridian's acquisitions. Reynolds' expression sharpened. The SEC is already involved? Preliminarily, they've contacted one of our board members informally. It's only a matter of time before they launch a formal investigation. Reynolds and Alvarez exchanged concerned glances. Which brings us back to the proposal I outlined this morning, I continued. A coordinated restructuring that addresses the immediate issues while protecting both firms from unnecessary reputational damage. We've reviewed your proposal, Alvarez said. While creative, it presents certain legal challenges, all of which can be addressed with proper documentation and oversight, I countered. Reynolds leaned forward. What you're proposing goes beyond simple damage control, Ms. Edwards. It's a fundamental realignment of resources and responsibilities. It's what I do, Mr. Reynolds. I identify structural weaknesses and develop solutions that strengthen the overall system, at considerable benefit to yourself, Alvarez noted pointedly. I met her gaze directly. I make no apologies for that. James Edwards stole my life savings to fund his relationship with Rachel Keller. He betrayed not just me personally, but my professional trust as well. Any solution must address both dimensions of that betrayal. Reynolds studied me for a long moment, his expression calculating. You've clearly thought this through carefully. But I'm curious, what made you think I would even consider such an unconventional approach? 2 things, I replied. First, your reputation for valuing long-term stability over short-term damage control. And second, Project Aurora. The mention of Aurora caused both Reynolds and Alvarez to tense visibly. Project Aurora was Pinnacle's confidential initiative to expand into corporate restructuring services, a direct competitive move into Meridian's territory. It wasn't public knowledge, but I had discovered references to it in the same data James had accessed. You know about Aurora, Reynolds said, his tone carefully neutral. I know that Pinnacle has been planning to develop restructuring capabilities to complement its investment services. I also know you've been struggling to find the right leadership for that initiative. A long silence followed as Reynolds considered the implications. I had just revealed that I possessed confidential information about Pinnacle's strategic plans, information that could be as damaging to them as the acquisition data James had. Stolen was to Meridian, but I had also revealed the perfect leverage point for my proposal. You're suggesting a mutual solution, Reynolds said finally. One that addresses the immediate crisis while simultaneously advancing Pinnacle's strategic objectives. I'm suggesting an elegant restructuring that turns a potential disaster into an opportunity for both parties, I corrected. Isn't that preferable to years of regulatory investigations and public recriminations? Reynolds turned to Alvarez. Your legal assessment? Unconventional but potentially viable, if carefully structured, she replied after a moment's consideration. It would require significant documentation and safeguards. Reynolds nodded, then turned back to me. I'm prepared to discuss your proposal in detail, Ms. Edwards, but I'll need assurances regarding Meridian's position. Naturally. I've already secured preliminary support from key executives, contingent on proper protections for Meridian's interests. For the next hour, we negotiated specifics, responsibilities, authorities, reporting structures, and oversight mechanisms. By the time we finished, the framework of a truly unprecedented arrangement had been established. I'll present this to our board tomorrow morning, Reynolds said as we concluded. I believe they'll recognize the wisdom of this approach, given the alternatives. As will Meridian's board, I replied, particularly when they understand the full implications of public disclosure. As I left Gibson's that evening, I felt a strange sense of calm. In less than 72 hours, I had discovered my husband's betrayal, uncovered a securities fraud scheme, and negotiated a solution that would not only protect my professional interests, but potentially transform my career in ways I never could have anticipated. James had spent our life savings on his mistress, believing I would never discover his deception. He had no idea that his betrayal would lead to him soon working for me. The leverage point I had uncovered wasn't just about evidence of wrongdoing. It was about identifying an opportunity hidden within the crisis, an opportunity that would reshape both our futures in ways James could never have imagined. 3 months after discovering James's betrayal, I stood in my new corner office on the 42nd floor of the Pinnacle Ventures building. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Chicago's skyline, the morning sun glinting off glass towers that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. My nameplate on the desk. Reed Morgan Edwards, Executive Director, Corporate Restructuring Division. A light knock on my open door drew my attention. Zoe stood there, tablet in hand, a satisfied smile on her face. The transition team just finished the final systems integration, she reported. The new division is officially operational. Just in time, I replied, checking my watch. The all-hands meeting starts in 20 minutes. The last 3 months had been a whirlwind of negotiations, legal arrangements, and strategic planning. The solution I'd negotiated with Edward Reynolds had evolved into something even more ambitious than my initial proposal. Meridian and Pinnacle had created a joint venture focused on corporate restructuring, with me at the helm. The arrangement allowed both firms to maintain their core identities while combining specific strengths in a new entity, and provided the perfect framework for James's consequences. "Is everything prepared for the department assignments?" I asked Zoe, who had followed me from Meridian to become my chief of staff in the new venture. "All set. The org chart is finalized and the individual notification emails are queued to send at 10:15 right after your opening remarks." Zoe hesitated. "He still doesn't know, does he?" "No," I confirmed. "As per our agreement with the SEC, James has been on administrative leave pending the completion of their investigation. Today is his first day back." The SEC had indeed launched an investigation into the trading activities surrounding Meridian's acquisitions. However, with both Meridian and Pinnacle's full cooperation, including the evidence I had gathered and Reynolds had subsequently discovered, the investigation had been focused specifically on Rachel Keller and 3 of her clients, rather than the institutions themselves. James, identified as a secondary participant, had been offered a settlement agreement. No criminal charges in exchange for full cooperation, disgorgement of all profits from the scheme, and acceptance of professional restrictions that would place him under strict supervision for 5 years. What he didn't yet know was who would be providing that supervision. "The conference room is ready," Zoe informed me. "All division personnel have been notified to attend, including those transitioning from both Meridian and Pinnacle." I gathered my presentation materials and took one last look at the Chicago skyline. So much had changed in 3 months. The initial shock and pain of James's betrayal had transformed into something else, not forgiveness, certainly, but a cold clarity that had guided my actions since that first night at the Langford Hotel. The crowded conference room fell silent as I entered. 48 professionals from diverse backgrounds, financial analysts, legal experts, operations specialists, all brought together under the new division. Some faces I recognized from Meridian, others from Pinnacle, and several new hires specifically recruited for the venture. And there, in the back row, looking uncomfortable and slightly disoriented, sat James. I took my position at the front of the room, my expression professionally neutral as I surveyed the assembled team. James hadn't noticed me yet, his attention focused on the phone in his hand. "Good morning," I began, my voice strong and clear. "Welcome to the inaugural meeting of the Corporate Restructuring Division, a pioneering joint venture between Meridian, Dynamics, and Pinnacle Ventures." James's head snapped up at the sound of my voice, his eyes widening in shock as he registered my presence at the podium. I continued without acknowledging him. "Each of you has been specifically selected for your expertise and potential contribution to our mission, identifying and implementing strategic restructuring solutions for corporations facing complex challenges." Moved through my presentation with practiced precision, outlining the division's objectives, methodologies, and market positioning. Throughout, I could feel James's stunned gaze, but I didn't meet his eyes until I reached the section on organizational structure. "The division will operate with 4 specialized teams," I explained, advancing the presentation to display the organizational chart. "Each team will be led by a senior director reporting directly to me, with project managers overseeing specific client engagements." I paused, finally allowing my gaze to meet James's. "Project analysts will provide essential support, conducting detailed financial assessments and implementing compliance protocols under close supervision." The implication wasn't lost on James or anyone else familiar with the situation. The position of project analyst was entry-level, typically filled by recent graduates or junior professionals, not by someone with James's experience. You'll all receive your specific team assignments immediately following this meeting, I continued, moving on to the next slide. I encourage you to review the division handbook, which outlines our operational procedures, ethical guidelines, and compliance requirements. James's face had drained of color as understanding dawned. Under the terms of his settlement agreement, he was required to accept designated employment with appropriate supervision. The position of project analyst, reporting through multiple layers of management ultimately to me, fulfilled those requirements precisely. As the meeting concluded, I watched James remain frozen in his seat while others filed out, already checking their emails for team assignments. Zoe approached him, tablet in hand. "Mr. Edwards," she said, her tone professionally detached. "Your workstation is in Section C, Cubicle 18. Your system credentials are limited to Level 2 access, with all activities logged for compliance review. Your direct supervisor will be Lindsay Chen, who expects your first analysis report by Friday. James." Finally stood, his expression a complex mixture of shock, humiliation, and dawning recognition of his new reality. "Morgan," he began, taking a step toward me. "We need to talk about this. This can't be—" "That's Executive Director Edwards in this building," Zoe interrupted smoothly. "And any concerns about your position should be addressed through proper channels, beginning with your direct supervisor." I gathered my materials, prepared to leave for my next meeting. As I passed James, I paused briefly. "The appropriate paperwork regarding our divorce was delivered to your attorney this morning," I informed him, my voice low enough that only he could hear. "The terms are non-negotiable if you wish to maintain the arrangement that's keeping you out of federal prison." His jaw tightened. "You planned this all along." "No," I corrected him. "You created this situation when you betrayed me both personally and professionally. I simply ensured the consequences matched the offense. The apartment, the savings. The Miami apartment lease has been terminated, with all your personal effects in storage. Your access to the Sierra Pacific account has been revoked as part of the SEC settlement. Our marital assets have been frozen, pending final divorce settlement, though I think you'll find the terms surprisingly equitable given the circumstances." James stared at me, finally seeing what he had failed to recognize throughout our marriage. My capacity for strategic thinking wasn't limited to corporate challenges. "Why this?" he asked finally, gesturing around the conference room. "Why not? Just fire me? Divorce me? Be done with it?" I looked at him directly, allowing him to see not anger but cool assessment in my eyes. "Because you need to understand the cost of underestimating someone's value. For 15 years you dismissed my attention to detail as excessive, my careful analysis as unnecessary. Now those same skills will determine your professional future." I moved toward the door, then added, "Lindsay expects you at your workstation in 15 minutes. I suggest you don't keep her waiting. Punctuality and attention to detail are heavily weighted in performance reviews." The Chicago skyline gleamed in the midday sun as I returned to my corner office. On my desk, Zoe had arranged the day's schedule alongside a small gift box with a card from my brother Eric. "Justice served. Proud of you." I smiled slightly as I opened the box to find a sleek new nameplate for my desk. It matched the official one perfectly, but with a subtle difference. Where my official title read Executive Director, this one simply stated, "Morgan Edwards, Chess Master." I placed it in my desk drawer, a private reminder that sometimes the most effective response to betrayal isn't immediate retaliation, but strategic patience. James had spent our life savings on his mistress, never imagining he'd end up working for me. He'd dismissed my financial acumen while secretly stealing from our accounts. Now, that same expertise would oversee every aspect of his professional life. The perfect restructuring indeed. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.